Everyone, welcome to this Excel tutorial for exercises on pivot tables and pivot charts. Let's get started. First, we're asked to use the data in the CRM export worksheet to answer the exercises. As we can see, the CRM worksheet contains a big data set with a lot of data on sales rep, products, unit price, units, revenue, region, date, and campaign. In the first exercise, we're asked to make an exact replica of the pivot table displayed below, including the design. So let's do that. First, we need to create a pivot table. So the way I like to create pivot tables is to actually first highlight the data set, make sure I get all the column headings all the way down to the last row. Once that's highlighted, I go over to Insert, and I click Pivot Table. I've already made my selection for the table arrange. Now I'm going to choose to put my pivot table in the existing worksheet directly next to the question. So let's see if that will work. Location, Exercises worksheet. Let's put it right here. Click on one cell, click OK, and we're given a blank pivot table called Pivot Table 1 to work with. Now, let's see what they've done in this pivot table. They've put the sales rep on the rows and the month on the columns, and they've grouped the month. So let's see. Sales rep in the rows. So far, so good. The date in the columns. Oh, that gets a little messy because we have individual dates. We're going to have to group this. We can do that a little later. And let's actually put the revenues in the values. Okay, now let's change the dates so they're grouped. Right-click on the first date, go down to Group, choose Months, and now it's grouped. And you can already see that our values are starting to look like the values in this table that we're asked to copy. Okay, 12,450. We also have grand totals for both the row and the column, so we'll leave those. Now we just have to change the design. Clicking on the pivot table, going over to design, I'm going to choose this blue design, and voila, we have replicated exactly the pivot table we were asked to replicate. Exercise 2. Change the values to percent and find the following numbers. So let's go ahead and change our pivot table values to percent. So we right click in one of the values and we go to show values as percent of grand total. That should work. And now we have values as a percentage of grand totals. And we're asked James Williams's revenue in percent of the grand total revenue. Well, where's James Williams? Here is his grand total as a percentage of the grand total of all salespeople. So 7.42. If we wanted the individual months, we can get that as well, but we're interested in his total. We're not given a month to look at. So 7.42. And we can format that as a percent with 2 decimal places. Great. B, what percentage of the total revenue from microphone sales came from Patricia Wilson? Well, looking at my current pivot table, I don't have the product information here. And this question seems to not be interested in the date. So let me put product information and remove date. I can easily do that. Clicking on the pivot table, remove date, put product. And now let's look for microphone sales revenue for Patricia Williamson, and we want it as a percentage of the total revenue, so that will be 8.10 8.10%. But 8.10%, be careful. That is Patricia Wilson's microphone sales as a percentage of total sales. The question seems to be asking us what percentage of total revenue from microphone sales came from Patricia Wilson. So we have to actually change these percentages to be percentages of the columns. So how do we do that? We right click, we go to show values as, and instead of percentage of grand total, we do percentage of column total because the product types are on the columns and we're asked for what percentage of the total microphone sales. Clicking on this, we see that Patricia Wilson's microphone sales were 28.95% of total microphone sales. Okay, so before that, 8.10% was of total sales of all product types. So this is what we're looking for. Tricky question. Okay, great. Next question. What percentage of total revenue, okay, this is important, of total revenue was generated in November? So now we have to go back to actual dates. So clicking on the pivot table, we're going to take the product out. We don't even really need the sales rep, but it's not going to hurt us. We'll bring back date. And since we already grouped them, they're already grouped. And now we want what percentage of total revenue was generated in November. We need to change this to grand total percentage. So right click, show values as percentage of grand total. And we see that November, we don't care about the salesperson. We care the grand total of November was 37.28% of the total revenue. So that's the value we are interested in. Change that to a percentage and show 2 decimal places. Great. Let's move on to exercise 3. In exercise 3, we're asked to find the values below. So let's zoom in a little. Question A. What's the average camera sale for Michael Brown in October? Okay, so that's asking for a lot. Coming over to the data set, let's create another pivot table. Let's start fresh. Insert, pivot table. Since it's already highlighted, I'm going to throw this pivot table next to this question. Clicking OK, I have a pivot table to play with. Now I have to think, based on the questions, how will I change my pivot table? Average camera sales for Michael Brown in October. So I need the date and the salesperson. So let's put salesperson there because there's a lot of them. I like to see it in the rows. Let's put the date in the columns and then the revenue. And this is the sum by default. The question seems to be asking for average. So let's change that to average. And then we're asked for October only. In fact, if we only wanted October, we could have also thrown this in the filters and chosen October this way as well. And we don't have the product type, so we need camera sales. So let's bring in product and put it in the columns. And now it seems like we have all the information we should need. So where's Michael Brown? Michael Brown. Camera sales. Average, we changed it to average, so we've got these things covered. And we've changed this to October, so we've actually have everything we need. And his average is going to be 39,840 for camera in October, Michael Brown average. Perfect. 39,840. Let's format that as a comma with no decimal places. Great. Next, what's the average selfie stick sale? Okay, so here we want average. Selfie stick is a product type, and we don't care about the month. So let's change our pivot table and simplify it. So we don't care about the month, so let's throw that out. We don't care about the sales rep. Let's throw that out. We care about the product. Seems like it would be nicer on the rows. And here, we've already have it on average, so we didn't need to change this. And we see that the average selfie stick sale was $3,336.60. Perfect. Next, we want John Miller's smallest camera sales. So now we care about the salesperson, and we care about the product type to be camera sales, and we want the smallest. So let's click on this pivot table. Let's bring the salesperson back in. Let's put product in the columns. There's less products, so it's always nicer to put the field with less choices in the columns. Let's change average to smallest or minimum. And we don't care about the date, so we have everything we need. Let's see. John Miller, camera, and we already asked for the minimum, so there is our value. John Miller's minimum sale for cameras was $19,920. Perfect. Okay, we're doing great. Let's move on to exercise 4. In exercise 4, we're asked to use slicers and activate the right values so the pivot table looks like this. Okay, so let's create another pivot table. Data is already highlighted. Insert, pivot table, existing worksheet. We're going to throw it right next to the question. Perhaps here. Click OK. And we have a blank pivot table. Let's make it look like this. This time we have to use slicers. So what are the fields we need? Looks like we have sales reps in the rows. We have product types in the columns and revenue in the values. And this looks like the sum of revenue, so we'll just leave it as default. Now, we're not going to use these filters, but it looks like we're only looking at tripods. So we will only look at tripods. And we're only looking at Jennifer and John Miller. So let's do this with slicers. Clicking on the pivot table, I go to Analyze, Insert Slicer, and I'm going to choose a slicer for sales rep and for product. Click OK. Now let me pull this a little bit to the right here so we have some room to see what's going on. I'm going to choose tripod only for product type, and the two names were Jennifer Smith and John Miller. So I click Jennifer Smith, and then I hold the control key and I click on John Miller. And maybe we can do a little formatting. We see that this table doesn't include grand totals for the column or the rows. So clicking on Design, I'm going to change this pivot table style to be the same as this one. And then we're going to say under Design, grand totals off for rows and columns. And voila! It looks like we have the same pivot table we were trying to achieve with slicers this time. Great. Question B. Make slicers and activate the right values so the pivot table looks like this. So let's see what this pivot table has. This pivot table has in the rows both the region, east-west, and the product type, camera, microphone. And in the columns has nothing, just the revenues. So what we need to do is to take product and throw it down here, The sales rep is not here, so let's throw the sales rep away. And let's bring the region on top of the product type. And what we see here is, we have the slicers to remove, but what we see here is starting to look a lot like what we're seeing here. Here we have east-west, but if you remember, we used slicers to just show tripod. So we need to actually use the slicers to just show microphone. So how do we change our slicers? This is a great lesson. Click on the pivot table, analyze, insert slicers. This time we're going to insert slicers for region and for product. And we can see our previous selections. And we can remove tripod and just show camera by clicking on camera, and microphone by holding Control and then clicking microphone. And as far as region, we're only looking at the east and the west. So we can uncheck south and north by checking east and west. And if we move these filters slightly over, we see that we have our values don't exactly agree with the values presented here. Because we inserted filters before, we need to remove those previous slicers. So if you recall, we moved these slicers over here, and look, we're only looking at 2 salespeople. Although we don't see their names here, we're seeing the numbers for only Jennifer and John. So we actually need to remove this. So we remove this sales filter and we move this one. In fact, we already have a duplicate of this, so we can delete this slicer altogether. And we can delete this slicer altogether. And then we can re-select camera and microphone. And we should see that we have the exact same values as here. In fact, we do. You may see this number not appearing down here. That's because that's the subtotal for the east, and this is the subtotal for the west. So we need to modify this to not show subtitles. So the lesson here was, if you want to put new slicers, don't forget about the old slicers. You need to delete the old slicers, or at least be aware that they're still active. Okay? So once we remove the old slicers and we use the new slicers, we filtered for east and west and camera and microphone. Now let's get rid of these subtotals. Clicking on the pivot table, we go to Design. Next to grand total, subtotals, we say do not show subtotals. And we have the same exact pivot table that was asked for in question B. Okay, let's move on to exercise 5. In exercise 5, we're asked to add a calculated field. Name the field gross revenue and multiply revenue by 1.1 to add 10% to sales tax. Make an exact replica of this table. 10% sales tax on top of revenue. Okay, so what do we have here? We have sales reps in the column. We have no explicit, in the rows rather, sorry. We have no explicit field in the columns. We have the sum of revenues, and then we have the sum of this calculated field, which we're going to create. Okay, so let's get started. We'll make a new pivot table using the same data set. Insert, pivot table, already highlighted. We'll throw it into this location. Click OK. We have a blank pivot table. Now we're going to add sales rep in the rows. We're going to leave the columns empty. We're going to put revenue in the values, and already you see that we have the first 2 columns matched. We'll change the formatting at the very end. Now let's add the calculated field. So we go to Analyze, Fields, Items, and Sets, Calculated Field. We're going to make a calculated field. We're going to call it Gross Revenue. And what is gross revenue going to be? Delete that 0, equals revenue, double click, times 1.1. This will add 10% sales tax to the revenue. Click OK. You see that it appears in the field list now, and it appears in the values. So we have 2 values here. Let's make this column a little wider. And you see the values are exactly the same. Let's do a quick formatting, highlight the values, go over to Home, change this to comma, 0 decimal places, and voila, we have made the exact same pivot table by creating this calculated field called gross revenue. Okay, let's move on to exercise 6. In exercise 6, we're asked to make the following pivot charts. First, a line chart that shows the total revenue per product per month. Okay, let's get started by creating a pivot table. We highlight the data, insert, pivot table, existing worksheet. Let's put it directly next to exercise 6. Click OK. And let's now think about what it's asking for. We want a line chart that shows the total revenue per month, per product per month. So we need the product and the date. So let's do product in the rows, date in the columns. We already grouped it. And then revenue in the values. Great, so we have grand totals. We don't need those grand totals. If we want to make things a little simpler looking, let's get rid of those. Okay, so we want to show the total revenue per product per month. So these are the numbers we need, and we want a line chart for this. So how do we get a chart out of this? Clicking on the pivot table, we go to Analyze, Pivot Chart. We'll choose Line. We'll choose the first line chart and see how this looks. Okay, great. We have a good looking chart here. Sometimes I like to put the date on the horizontal axis and then put the product types in the legend. If we want to do this, it's a simple swap. If you like the way this looks, you can leave it as is. But if you'd rather have it the other way, like I would, you can simply grab date and switch its position with product. And this looks much cooler to me. I'm looking at the revenue for camera sales here from October to December, for microphone in orange, for a tripod in yellow, and for a selfie stick in gray. If I want to format these numbers, they will reflect, and I have myself a nice looking pivot chart. Okay, great. Question B, make a clustered column chart that shows the total revenue per sales rep per month. Okay, let's change this. If you want to create another one, you can simply create another pivot table and then get another chart out of it. But for purposes of moving this video along, let me actually just modify this current pivot table. So, clicking on the pivot table, I want total revenue per sales rep per month. So, let me put, I don't care about the product type, so let me take that out and bring the sales reps information in. And this looks like exactly what we need, except it's a line chart. So let's change this to a column chart. So we'll go over to Design, Chart Type, Instead of line, we're going to click column and click the first choice. Click OK. And now we have ourselves the months on the horizontal axis and a legend for each of the sales reps, and we have a clustered column chart. Now if you want to switch the order of this, if you prefer it that way, you can do it as well by switching like we did for the line chart. If this is preferable to you, keep it this way. Both of them are giving us the same exact information. A clustered column chart that shows the total revenue per sales rep per month. Perfect. Now, finally, part C. A clustered column chart that shows the total revenue per sales rep per month. Okay. Oh, surely here we're not asked to make the same chart as we made in question B. In fact, here what we actually want to do is perhaps make a clustered column chart that shows the average total revenue per sales rep per month. So let's do this. Instead of total, let's do average. So the quick change that we need to make to this, first off, let me go back to the other view. I prefer this view. It looked more aesthetically pleasing to me. What I need to change is change the sum to average. And that's all I need to do. And now I'm looking at the average revenue per sales rep per month for the 3 months that we have data. So I can change that to minimum, maximum, sum, count, and average, which is what we chose. Okay, great. So we made a bunch of pivot tables and a bunch of pivot charts. We're able to use slicers, removing filters, adding filters, and everything in between. Pivot charts are an extremely useful tool for advanced techniques in Excel. You're doing really well and you're improving nicely. Keep up the good work and practice. Till next time, goodbye.